Right now, Japan is debating one of the biggest constitutional changes since the end of World War II. A draft proposal currently being debated in Parliament could allow national elections to be postponed, extend lawmakers' terms without a public vote, and allow the cabinet to issue emergency orders with the force of law during a national crisis. Supporters argue these measures are necessary for scenarios where large scale disasters or security crises make normal governance difficult or even impossible. Critics argue that once such powers are written into a constitution, the central issue shifts from how they are used to how they might be expanded in the future. Japan faces both realities at once. It is one of the most disaster prone countries in the world, with risks such as the potential Nanking Trough earthquake capable of disrupting national infrastructure on a large scale. At the same time, its current constitution was designed in 1947 without a clear framework for extended national emergencies. So in this video, we'll examine what Japan's proposed emergency powers actually contain, why supporters believe they are necessary, why critics remain cautious, and the key questions that remain unresolved. And before we continue, this is Japan Yuntaku, and on this channel, we discuss Japanese politics using government documents, research papers, and news articles to understand what's actually being discussed in Japan. Before we discuss the current proposal, let's establish what emergency powers actually are. In most democracies, power is deliberately slow. Passing a law requires debate, votes, committees, and compromise. That slowness that we experience in democracies helps prevent any one person or group from acting unilaterally. But in a genuine crisis, this key feature could be dangerous. If a disaster destroys infrastructure across an entire country overnight, waiting weeks for parliamentary procedure could cost lives. Emergency powers are the constitutional answer to that problem. They allow governments to act faster by bypassing the checks when circumstances make that standard process unworkable. Every major democracy handles this differently. France's Article 16 gives the president sweeping individual authority in a crisis. Germany has a state of defense framework with strict parliamentary controls. The United States allows the president to issue executive orders, although critics argue that they have been abused for decades. Japan, by contrast, has only a limited mechanism designed for short-term parliamentary continuity, and does not clearly define how extended national emergencies should be handled within its constitutional framework. In the current constitution, there is a provision allowing the House of Councillors to hold emergency sessions when the lower house is dissolved, but it covers a maximum of around 70 days and was designed for short gaps between elections. So why is this debate happening now? In reality, the issue has been building for years. Japan faces some of the highest disaster risks in the world, and experts have repeatedly warned that a future Nankai Trough earthquake could unalive roughly 290,000 people, force millions to evacuate, and cause economic damage of roughly 300 trillion yen, which is roughly half of Japan's GDP. If such a disaster struck during a national election or after the House of Representatives had been dissolved, some lawmakers argue that Japan's constitution does not clearly explain how the government should continue to function. At the same time, Japan's increasingly uncertain security environment, including tensions surrounding Taiwan and repeating North Korean missile launches, has reinforced calls from some politicians for stronger constitutional provisions to ensure government continuity during national emergencies. Politically, the timing also reflects years of discussion over constitutional revision, particularly by the Liberal Democratic Party, which has long advocated adding emergency provisions to the constitution. While political parties remain divided over the scope and safeguards of such powers, there is broad agreement that Japan should be prepared for extraordinary crises, which explains this draft proposal that was published in May 2026. The draft proposal, prepared by the House of Representatives Legislative Bureau, outlines four main mechanisms. The proposal revolves around four practical problems lawmakers are trying to solve. I'll leave the link in the description so you can check this out yourself. The emergency clause will be executed when one or more of the following catastrophes occur: large-scale natural disasters such as earthquakes, large-scale spread of infectious diseases, disturbance of public order due to internal unrest, armed attacks from abroad, or other situations equivalent to such a situation. There are four major pillars to what will occur after the clause is in effect. First, the election postponement. Under the current constitution, a general election must be held within 40 days of dissolution. But what if a catastrophic disaster or conflict makes a nationwide election genuinely impossible to hold within that window of time? The proposal would allow the cabinet to certify an election difficult situation and postpone the vote, provided Parliament approves it in advance by majority or supermajority. This is still being debated. Second, term extensions. If elections are postponed, existing members' terms will be extended. Provisions will also prevent Parliament from being dissolved or going to recess, and ban any constitutional amendments while the emergency is active. Third, online Parliament. The proposal will explicitly allow remote attendance via video link, something the current constitution does not clearly permit. This is the least contested of the four pillars. The fourth proposal is the most controversial: emergency cabinet orders. The cabinet may issue emergency orders having the force of law where circumstances make it impossible to wait for legislative action. Such orders must be submitted promptly to the Diet for approval, and if not approved within the still debated number of days after the next Diet session convenes, they lose their effect. Taken together, these four mechanisms are designed to keep government functioning during national emergencies. As you can see, there are a few important constraints built into the proposal. It does not include a general rights suspension clause. Things are still being debated, but the final draft may require a supermajority approval. It mandates elections as soon as conditions allow, and it explicitly prohibits constitutional amendments during the emergency period. The proposal, therefore, attempts to balance emergency flexibility with constitutional safeguards. However, history teaches us that power can always derail democracies. To understand the opposition, you need to go back to the constitution Japan had before the current one, the Meiji Constitution of 1889. Unlike the current constitution, the Meiji Constitution gave the emperor broad emergency powers. Under Article 8, the emperor could issue imperial ordinances with the force of law whenever the imperial diet was not in session, subject to later approval by the diet. While this power was intended to allow the government to respond quickly during extraordinary circumstances, critics argued that they concentrated too much authority in the executive and lacked meaningful constitutional safeguards. Opponents of today's proposal often point to Japan's wartime experience as a cautionary example. In 1941, Japan was already at war in China and preparing for a wider conflict in the Pacific. Rather than holding a general election, the Imperial Diet passed a law extending the terms of the House of Representatives members by 1 year, arguing that wartime conditions made an election impractical. Although this extension was not carried out under Article 8 itself, critics argue it illustrates how democratic procedures can be altered during national emergencies when governments are granted extraordinary powers. Now, this matters because the 2026 proposal to extend Diet member terms without an election is structurally similar to what exactly happened in 1941. The Japan Communist Party cited this directly in its submissions to the Constitutional Review Commission. The authors of Japan's 1947 constitution were aware of this abuse, so they deliberately omitted it. Instead, they enshrined parliamentary sovereignty and regular elections as near absolute principles. The absence of emergency powers in the current constitution is not an oversight. The Constitutional Democratic Party, which, yes, still operates as a separate party in the upper house, argues that the government should strengthen existing democratic practices before asking for additional constitutional powers. The party has criticized the government for delaying the convening of extraordinary diet sessions when requested and for relying heavily on reserve funds, arguing that both practices reduce normal parliamentary scrutiny over government spending. So when critics evaluate the 2026 proposal, they focus less on whether Japan should have emergency powers and more on how those powers will be constrained. Their concern is whether the proposed safeguards are strong enough to prevent extraordinary powers from being misused. Proponents of emergency powers are aware of this criticism. That is why, as mentioned earlier in this video, the current proposal has safeguards built into the proposal. Proponents of the emergency clause point to a specific engineering gap in the current constitution. Under Article 54, the lower house must hold an election within 40 days of dissolution, and convene within 30 days of that election. But the constitution says nothing about what happens if a catastrophic disaster strikes during that window and elections become impossible. The existing workaround is the House of Councilors emergency session, which allows the upper house to pass temporary measures while the lower house is absent. But this mechanism was designed for a maximum 70-day window, and the 2011 Noda Cabinet decision confirmed that legislative terms cannot be extended by ordinary statute. Therefore, the current constitution does not address the hypothetical problem if a crisis drags on beyond that window. Proponents argue that this reflects the practical limits of the current framework. In previous disasters such as the 2011 Tohoku or Great East Japan earthquake, Elections were postponed for 8 months. That's way past 70 days. And with the anticipated Nankai Trough earthquake, it's not far-fetched to believe that elections may be disrupted for a long time. This is the core argument proponents keep returning to, and it is the one point where the case of amendment is legally hard to dismiss. Proponents clarify that their goal is not to expand executive power, but to ensure the Diet remains functional enough to constrain the cabinet even in a crisis. Critics of the proposed emergency clause argue that, aside from the question of extending parliamentary terms during an unprecedented national disaster, the overall case for introducing a constitutional emergency mechanism remains weak. The first line of argument is necessity. Japan has already managed major crises under the current constitutional system. During the Great East Japan earthquake, large parts of northeastern Japan were severely damaged. However, the national government and the Diet continue to function without invoking any formal emergency constitutional powers. From this perspective, critics argue that the post-war system has already proven capable of handling large-scale disruption. The absence of an emergency clause has not prevented government continuity in practice. The second issue is the triggering conditions. The proposal refers broadly to events such as large-scale natural disasters, pandemics, internal unrest, armed attacks, or other situations equivalent to such situations. Critics argue that these categories remain vague in practice. It is unclear what level of disruption would be sufficient to activate emergency authority. More complex cases are also difficult to define in advance, but to include or other situations equivalent to such a situation is dangerous. For example, a regional disaster concentrated in the Tokyo area could simultaneously affect population centers and central government institutions. While such an event may not qualify as a nationwide emergency in geographic terms, Japan's political functions are heavily centralized in the capital. This raises a constitutional question. Would a disruption centered in Tokyo meet the threshold for activating emergency powers, even if other parts of the country remain largely unaffected? The third argument is legal necessity. Critics argue that many of the intended goals can be achieved through ordinary legislation rather than constitutional revision. In practical terms, this is also a faster route. Election laws, administrative procedures, and disaster response systems can be revised through standard legislative processes, without the need for a constitutional amendment, which typically requires a higher political threshold and longer deliberation. Finally, some argue that strengthening local government capacity may be a more effective response in practice. Many natural disasters in Japan are regional rather than nationwide. In that context, expanding local administrative capacity may address the underlying problem more directly than expanding a nation-level emergency authority. When we review what each political party is saying, the LDP, the JIP, and the DPFP agree that an emergency clause is necessary. The Centrist Reform Alliance and Team Mirai take a more cautious approach. Parties that openly oppose the emergency clause include the CDP, Japan Communist Party, Reiwa Shinsengumi, and Sanseto. Public opinion is far less clear, with results varying depending on the polling organization. The following numbers are responses based on emergency powers. For example, the more left-leaning Asahi Shimbun reports that 54% of respondents believe that there is no need to revise the constitution, while 33% believe it should be revised. The Mainichi Shimbun reports that 38% of respondents are undecided, 32% support constitutional revision in some form, and 29% oppose it. By contrast, the more right-leaning Yomiuri Shimbun reports almost opposite results, with just over 50% supporting constitutional revision and roughly 39% opposing it. The Sankei Shimbun, another conservative newspaper, reports that 66% of respondents support constitutional revision. With all that said, the current proposal is still being actively debated. At this stage, there are 5 major questions that lawmakers have yet to resolve. First is the scope of emergency. The proposal refers to situations that are widespread enough to disrupt the integrity of an election, but it does not define exactly where that threshold lies. Second is the duration of emergency powers. There are different proposals, such as 70 days, 6 months, or a year. Third is oversight. While the cabinet cannot act entirely on its own, there is still debate over who should ultimately determine whether an emergency has been properly declared. Some parties support greater involvement from the Supreme Court. Fourth is democratic legitimacy. If the House of Representatives has already been dissolved, should former lawmakers be allowed to return without a new election? Critics argue this weakens democratic accountability, while supporters argue it prevents Japan from functioning without a legislature. Finally, there is the approval threshold itself. Should emergency certification require a simple majority or 2/3 majority? A higher threshold provides a stronger safeguard against abuse, while a lower threshold may be easier to achieve during a genuine national crisis. As you can tell, these 5 unresolved questions are critical to this debate. Prime Minister Takaichi has expressed interest in advancing constitutional reform in early 2027. That gives lawmakers less than a year to reach an agreement on some of the most fundamental questions surrounding Japan's system of government. Even then, the amendment faces a difficult path. Japan's constitution requires a 2/3 majority in both houses of the Diet before any amendment can be submitted to a national referendum. It must then receive a majority support from voters. Given the current level of disagreement among political parties, constitution revision remains far from certain. So what do you think? Should Japan introduce constitutional emergency powers, or should the current system remain unchanged? Or is there a compromise that will help avoid a democratic collapse? Let me know in the comments below. And believe it or not, this is only one of the 4 major constitutional amendments proposed by the ruling Liberal Democratic Party. In a future video, we'll examine all 4 proposals and what they could mean for Japan's political system. But if you want to learn more about one of these proposals, you can watch the video about Japan's self-defense forces. Like the video if you learned something new, and subscribe to learn more about Japanese politics.